one thing I liked about your analysis was how you engage with the Akkadian term,
Mm,
the Akkadian term, the Akkadian term Balia, which
mm,
means which means my lord, and
right.
I'm not sure entirely if it I but I do think it should taken seriously as a as a suggestion because there are two divine names in it. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean that kind of came late, like a lot of the ideas, they just kept piling on top of each other, and it's one thing leading to another. Where it first started by just the scriptures themselves and rereading the story, and then looking at it even from a Hebrew perspective, and just to see how, because you haven't read the book, right? You've seen the comic,
Yeah, I've
correct?
seen the comic. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So obviously the book goes into a lot more details in terms of making a case for. I mean, the whole idea is basically to offer an alternative to the documentary hypothesis, right? The documentary hypothesis tells us that, okay, there's a author J and author E, and this is most likely why. I mean, I'm kind of uh, doing caricature here, but this is kind of why we have this anthropomorphic character, which is Jehovah, and this immaterial, figure that is more like Elohim in this text. But what I've found is that if you ignore those names and you look at the uh, the trait of, if you look at the anthropomorphic character in the story, which most of the time is referred to as Yahweh. There are exceptions, and number of places he's referred to as Elohim. But if you ignore the name, just look at the anthropomorphic character and the immaterial one, what you realize is that every interaction with the anthropomorphic character revolves around this political idea, the need to make a covenant, and everything revolves around that, while the material character now becomes secondary and really reflects kind of Bronze Age type religious activity. And and that's really the crux of it. In the text, um, the anthropomorphic character can be seen as a lord, as a more man in the flesh, and and the story kind of totally makes sense from that perspective. And so it started from that, and then from there I thought, well, this looks like it makes sense, but maybe it's just coincidence. And so I started looking for potential candidate. I'm like, well, if this story is true, if it happened, if something happened in history, who would be the most likely contender? And I started reviewing all the pharaohs, all the Mesopotamian kings, Hittite kings, read about their lives, their story, their what they were doing, etc. And it's only when I came across Hammurabi that all the pieces again of the puzzle started to fit together like magnet. And so it to me he seems like the most likely candidate. And as I explained in the comic, it doesn't mean that it is, but it certainly looked like a lot of pieces are coming together. And out of that came the sextant multiplier, because that was the other problem. Well, now chronologies don't fit, right? And yet, if again, it all starts with that axiom that if that lord was a mortal and a Mesopotamian king, then if you look back in Mesopotamia in the Bronze Age, they were not using base 10, they were using base 60. And if you look at the conversion from base 60 to base 10, you realize that there's a very simple, easy to make mistake when converting from base 60 to base 10 that has been done many times in extra biblical sources. You can see that mistake, and if you assume that or suggest the idea that perhaps the scribes who inherited these texts didn't know how to properly convert. They were not mathematicians, they were scribes, although at the time, I'm not sure there was much of a difference between the two, but still, they made a mistake. They converted the easy way as opposed to converting the right way. And then you ended up with the dates we have in the Bible that are totally off. And if you fix the dates by reverting and applying the proper conversion, which you can do, like the shortcut is basically to multiply by 610. And again, in the book, I provide a full explanation as to why, how, and other scholars who've identified similar problems. Then you find that the dates fit, and that's where I am.
Yeah. So, I do agree that Hammurabi certainly plays a role in the Abraham story. In the is it Genesis 14 when there's Amraphel
Right.
And I think David Falk gave a good argument
Yes.
as
Hammurapi.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yes.
and
Yeah. And I actually, it was a good point you made, because I hesitated. I was thinking at some point of calling that character Hammurapi as opposed to Hammurabi, and I figured, said, well, everybody knows him by the name Hammurabi, so this is why I put it as an annex where I talk about David Falk and his interpretation, and why Hammurabi is actually a better option.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
and an interesting thing about Hammurabi that might link in with your with your theories is that his name probably means the
Ancestor
Rephaim, the ancestor
of the
is
dead.
our kinsman
Yeah.
according to Seth Sanders
Hmm.
and and apparently and y- and that probably refers to some sort of ancestor and veneration
Yeah.
and your argument was that that's essentially how Yahweh became became a god.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes. And I've tried to reach out to David and give him a little synopsis of what I was doing and why I thought it'd be nice to have a conversation with him. But again, my experience has been that I don't know, scholars just don't like to engage with what appears to be a fringe idea. And it is fringe up until somebody else picks it up and says, actually, this is worth looking into it.
Yeah, I am not entirely sure if I if I if I buy it because to be to be honest these euhemeristic ideas that they've been suggested over history for thousands of years, ever since the ancient Greeks, and more often than not, they turn out to be false. But I am willing to talk to you and hear what you have to say. And there is there are some theories like that are quite plausible. Like I don't know if you've ever encountered the theory of the Assyriologist Amar Anus. He believes that well he suggests that the name Titan in Greek mythology, it may be derived from from the the Akkadian word Ditanu, which was a tribe of Amorites, because in Ugaritic they the term is equated with Rephaim, so so the term gets like a cacophonic link, and that is I think in some early Greek texts we find that with the Titans as well. I'm not sure quite if I buy it, but it's interesting, and I think it should be considered.
Mm. Didn't you write something about that on Twitter at some point, or it kind of rings a bell?
I think I might have on my old blog. I think I might have, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, I'm not looking for people who buy into what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
I'm looking for people who are willing to engage and just have a discussion, look at it, challenge me, ask questions. That's all I can ask for, and then you figure if it makes sense or not, and if we can poke holes into it. I've been trying to poke holes into it for the last 20 years. That's all I've been doing, because at the end of the day, I'm not interested in coming up with another theory that makes no sense. But if it holds, then yeah, I think it definitely needs to be looked at.
Yeah. So also I was in how yeah also I do think it's good to find someone who agrees with me that the basic idea of Genesis 14 is pretty true to life, because I think the book the book have you read the book behind the scenes of the Old Testament?
No, I don't think so. No.
It's an interesting book, and one of the authors makes the case that he points out. I think he draws on Kenneth Kitchen. I think he says that
Yeah, I've
the
read Kenneth Kitchen.
that the only time where you could really get these wars taking place is
In the
Canaan.
Bronze Age. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah, no, I've read Kenneth
the,
Kitchen, and he's an interesting character as well. Definitely not. He's not in the heart of a lot of biblical scholars. A lot of people seems, because he's very much pro historicity. A lot of people are keeping him at a distance. But I think what I'm seeing, I find that in the last few years, it looks like the pendulum is there's a tendency for this pendulum to kind of come back, because for 20 or 30 years, at least in Europe and in Montreal, and Montreal is kind of heavily European influence from, because of the French and all that. So in terms of the scholars that are being looked at, there's significant influence from France and whatnot. And the idea of a historical Abraham or patriarchs, I think that's widely rejected at this point, not just by European scholars, but there is definitely I think people are coming to realize that some questions need to be answered, because we can't just, I'll put it on the Babylonian exile. There was more to it, and it goes back much earlier. And now I haven't seen a lot of people suggesting it goes any earlier than 1100th century, but even then,
Isn't there one scholar who believes that the early the early chapters of Genesis just originated with the patriarchs, isn't it?
That the say that again, that the early chapters originate with
the patriarchs. There's one
Well,
scholar. I don't know much about it though.
I'm not aware of any scholar, like modern scholar, who believed that the patriarchs were actual who lived. I mean, I what I'm aware is that most scholars still see them as fictitious characters, or maybe some legends or some myth or something. But if you come across scholars who actively suggest that the patriarchs, and I'm not talking about apologetic or anyone who's,
No, I'm
doing it
talking.
from a faith based, but
Yeah, I'm talking about like Abraham and like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Those people.
yep.
Now, my view is somewhere in the middle. The I think that Abraham could have existed. I think that Genesis 14 is probably is probably very old. But well, I say this because you've got it matches the Middle Bronze Age quite well, and you've got the and Abraham is called a Hebrew, which may or may not be related to the term Habiru, but the caveat I would add is that it doesn't match up with the rest of the Abraham narratives, and that's something that quite a few commentaries, like I think Robert Alter and the Jewish Study Bible point out. So I think
and same thing with Westermann, Klaus Westermann, and all that. Although Klaus Westermann did suggest that he rejected the idea that Abraham could have been a deified ancestor, but he never, because he does suggest that someone should do a study on the ancestor worship in the patriarch story, but he never suggests that Abraham's Lord could have been a deified ancestor. He doesn't, again, all these scholars, most of these scholars assume that the story of Abraham, they start with the axiom that the Lord is a God. And then that's how they approach the story.
But it not none be, of them. Though.
I'm sorry?
No, carry on.
Well, I would say none of them have asked the question, what if Abraham's Lord was immortal? And what I found is that the entire story, the dynamic of the story completely changes. And that's how I think that's how we can solve the puzzle. You have to, and not just looking, again, as I was saying earlier, you can't rely on the name. You have to look at the character, the anthropomorphic character versus the immaterial Elohim. And if you do the exercise, you will find that a lot in the text supports the idea of a man in the flesh. Obviously, there are some redactions that, and you can see there are clearly layers that were added prophetic layers or whatever to predict what was going to happen. But for the most part, the story, 90 to 95% of the story can be taken literally and becomes a lot more clear. And I think what happened is that I suspect, and I can't prove this, but I suspect that the text was originally written in Akkadian and was at some point translated into Hebrew. And because some of the terms better fit Akkadian, and I'm not talking about Belial, but other terms, when you look at them from an Akkadian perspective as opposed from a Hebrew perspective, it better fits the context, the secular context that I'm talking about. And it would make sense because again, if Abraham made this covenant with Hammurapi, obviously Abraham didn't had writing skills at the time, or it's unlikely that they had much writing skills. But the story could have been written down because it was state affair, not as a religious story, but because it was deed to the land. It could have very likely be written down in Akkadian and preserved that way for many years until it was at some point translated.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that. I'm not tip top when it comes to the Akkadian loanwords in Genesis. I know there are some, like there's quite a lot of them in the flood account, but
right.
That's
and in my
not sure about the Abraham account. After
Gilgamesh, yeah.
So yeah, so here's a question: why do you assume that it has to be Hammurapi? Because if we're talking about deified ancestors, wouldn't it make more sense for Abraham to have become Yahweh? And that would make sense if Sarah was his wife. I think that might actually be a more simple
explanation.
More simple, yeah, explanation. If we're coming from your perspective.
Yeah, I thought about that as well, but the text, when you look at the scriptures, and when you visualize this anthropomorphic Lord as a man in flesh, it cannot be Abraham. It doesn't work. The story just doesn't read well. It doesn't. At least that's what I found. And for the story to make sense, at least in my perspective, it has to be a Mesopotamian lord, and he has to be in league with the 4 Eastern kings of Genesis 14, because they both pursue the same goal, which is to subdue the people of Sodom. Right? When you look at the arc of the story, first of all, you have most scholars, even the scholars who acknowledge that Genesis 14 is an older text, and a number of scholars and commentators will accept and acknowledge that Genesis 14 likely has some pretty old roots, right? Like you're saying. But then when you look at the arc of the story, these commentators still don't understand how Genesis 14 contributes to the story of Abraham.
You're breaking up.
Connection to Yahweh, right? And yet, when you realize that there's a reason Genesis 14 is there. It's right at the beginning. It's a preamble to the story. It sets the stage for the need to have a covenant, right? So you have these 4 Eastern kings that are launching a punitive campaign against Sodom, and Sodom happens to be the city where Lot dwelt. And they take the people away. And when Abraham learns that his nephew's been taken away, he chases them, right? He hits them and basically returns with all the goods. And you would expect at that point these Eastern kings to retaliate or make a covenant, but they disappear. Next thing you know, chapter 15, God appears and tells Abraham, here's a covenant, and I'm going to give you the land of Canaan, and you're going to respect and be loyal and respect my laws and all that, right? So in the flow of the story, when you visualize this Lord as being this great Mesopotamian Lord, who's basically coming back because he's just been defeated and he's staying far away in Babylonia, and that's the best way to solve the problem, is to make a covenant with a local guy. And obviously the next problem becomes, because back then, as you know, covenant were made between two men, not between two states. And so the idea of the inheritance becomes very critical, right? If you want to, because if Abraham dies, well, what happens to this covenant? Well, you need to have a heir that will inherit and respect the covenant. And so Abraham is not able to have a son with his half sister. And at some point you find that the Lord shows up, says, where is she? And she's in the tent, and there he goes. And the Lord comes back and says, okay, 9 months, you'll have a son. Right? And so you realize that he just did exactly what Abraham did with Hagar, right? So at the time, this was normal. And Isaac becomes the son of the promise. He's the perfect son, because he is the blood of the Lord.
Yeah.
And because Sarah is half sister with Abraham, the son Isaac duly carries the bloodline of Abraham through Sarah. It's the same, it's the same bloodline. So it's the perfect son for the promise. And again, in chapter 22, when Lord asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, he's telling Abraham, sacrifice your son, your only, the one you love. Right? Why would that be Isaac? Right? I mean, it's obviously Ishmael.
No, I see that as a hint that maybe that Isaac probably was his son, because I think the idea more is that God helped Abraham to have his child, but I don't think he literally had sex.
Well,
he had sex with Sarah.
If you think of the Lord as a God, you're absolutely right. It's the Spirit of God who assisted and helped Abraham have a son, and that's what the tradition tells us, right? But if you read the story from a secular perspective and you picture this God as a mortal, he's the one who visits Sarah in the tent.
Yeah, but then we have stories about Gilgamesh was two-thirds God and 1/3 man, and I take that statement as implying that he essentially had two fathers and one mother. And I think there's something like that in Greek mythology with these stories, with the story of Theseus. So I don't know, but it could be that in the original story, God actually had sex with Sarai, and therefore Isaac would be a demigod, something. Possibly. I don't know.
Possibly. I mean, I'm open, but if I read it very down to earth, I see a guy walking in the tent. I see Sarah becoming pregnant, and that ain't Abraham's son. I mean, Abraham adopts and has a son, recognizes him, legitimizes him as his son. But then why would, anyway, I think there's just too many of these details and coincidences that, taken individually, you could find all kinds of other reasons to explain them. But the fact that the link is the same link, and all you have to do is change one premise, one axiom. Just change that one axiom. Abraham made a covenant with a man as opposed to Abraham making a covenant with the Lord. And you realize that all the bits and the pieces tie together.
Yeah, another thing. Do you think, and this was one of your good points, and was that I think do you think that Adonai could be a translation of Babelia?
I think so.
Yeah, because I think that's a plausible argument, actually.
Mm.
And what else? So moving on from Abraham, do you have a let's hear your views on the Exodus, because that's also an interesting discussion. That's also an interesting discussion in biblical history.
Yes. Well, I don't know. I just look. I haven't spent nearly as much time on the Exodus as I did on the story of Abraham. Exodus kind of came up after doing the again, going back to the mathematical error correction between sexagesimal and decimal. And if you correct the date of the Exodus, you realize that whether, because one of the challenge today when scholars are trying to resolve the issue of the Exodus is that when you look at it from the Temple of Solomon and you go back 480 years, it doesn't match Ramses II, right? And if you take it from Abraham, and if you assume Abraham lived somewhere around, whether it's 2,000 years or the 19th or 18th century before Christ, whichever date you choose, and then you add all the descendants and everything, then you get here. So the 2 days don't work, right? But if you start with Hammurapi, start with Solomon, and you multiply the 480 years by 0.6 or 6/10, you go back 288 years. And if you go from Abraham and add all the descendants and everything, you line up here. And what's that date? That date is precisely the end of the Battle of Kadesh, when the treaty between Egypt and the Hittites was signed. And so it's just this alignment that aligns with Ramses II, it aligns with everything that, every scholars suggest that if there was something similar to an Exodus, it would have taken place during Ramses II. That's the most likely date when it would have happened. Now, they also say that, yeah, but there's no Exodus out of Egypt. We would have known. And so all I'm saying is well, maybe there wasn't an Exodus. Maybe the people stayed exactly where they were. It's just that they were slave of Egypt because they were a vassal state, right? Canaan was a vassal state of Egypt at that point. And after that Hittite treaty, Egypt started to relax and retreat back into Egypt. And that, for me, is the story of the Exodus. So obviously it was embellished, it was, whatever, but I think that the crux of the story can align with that.
That's plausible, that's actually quite similar to, I think, to Ronald Hendel's view in a book that I'm currently reading
Okay.
called Five Views on the Exodus.
Okay. I'll take note of that. 5 years. 5 years on Exodus.
No, no, Five Views on
Oh,
Exodus.
5 views. Okay, sorry. 5 views on Exodus. Interesting. Well, I know Friedman also has some interesting perspective in Kitchen as well.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think
but
my
the other interesting bit and pieces about Exodus is when you look at the Temple of Karnak, where Ramses II describes his victory over the Hittites. Right? We know he didn't win, but he pretends he won. He
yeah.
won.
That's
You
why
read.
that's why I think that that's why I think that the silence of Egyptian records probably doesn't mean much.
Right. I agree. But in the poem of Tantor, that's the name of the scribe who write this poem, right? You read the sequence of events in the poem of Tantor, and you compare that with Exodus 14, which is the crossing of the Red Sea, and you realize it's the exact same ideas that are flowing, and you see that the Lord is going to fight for us. He the chariots tumble in the water. They will fight. And everything that happens, they're not described in the same way, but the main ideas are there in both texts. And so uh, I think I've only seen one other scholar more recently, like a year or two ago, publish a paper, and I can't remember his name, where he too suggested that there were some similarities between the poem of Tantor and the Red Sea crossing.
Yeah, it definitely should be looked at. I think
Mm.
the now I think some sort of movement outside of Egypt is entirely implausible. I don't see
Mhm.
see any reason why it couldn't have happened because I think I don't know if you've read David A. Fawkes'
Mhm.
recent
Yes.
book on the Ark.
Oh, not the book. No,
Oh
not the book.
yeah, he points out that the Ark of the Covenant, it's similar
Mm. Yes,
to Middle and New
absolutely.
Kingdom ritual furniture, and you don't find this in the first millennium. So that's
Correct.
a sign that that it's probably very old, and you don't find it you don't otherwise find it in Canaan, and that's that suggests that suggests to me that maybe this was actually made in Egypt and then
Hmm.
brought out into Canaan.
Right.
I don't know if we can if we can call it the Exodus, but it's certainly a movement outside of outside of Egypt in into Canaan. So it's an Exodus.
Right. Yeah. No. Absolutely. And I like the comment you made on the comic where you indicated that the ark, was Egyptian, and it's a little subtle, but in the comic, I don't call it an ark when Isaac makes the box. I call it a chest.
Uh,
And only after they come out of Egypt do I call it an ark, and it has the shape and the look of the ark. But yeah, I mean it's a detail. But I mean I agree. I think I I believe as I suggest in the comic, I believe there's reasonable evidence suggesting that perhaps the Hyksos kings were the descendants of Abraham. Again, if you look at the context, and if you buy into the idea that Abraham made a covenant with this Mesopotamian overlord, right? So now we have the Amorites, right? Dynasty of Hammurapi, who was reigning and had the entire Mesopotamia. We had his son Isaac,
Yeah.
controlling Canaan.
Yeah.
And now the Hyksos are controlling Egypt, right?
Yeah.
And just like with the kings of England and the kings of France and all that throughout history, it was always a family thing, right? And they were always related somehow one another and whatnot. So it would make sense in that context that the Hyksos would be the descendants of Abraham or / Hammurapi, right? That they were all part of that same group of rulers. And so I think those Hyksos have left a legacy. Not only did they bring chariots and horses and new warfare tactics or whatever in Egypt, but they might have left some legacy in terms of maybe even the ark, maybe the name Pharaoh, all kinds of things that only appear after they leave. Because we have very little information about the Hyksos themselves. You know, we barely know who they were, barely know when they ruled. So the information is very, how to say that, very minimal. So it's mostly speculation at that point. But it creates a nice, and it kind of integrates all these bits and pieces in a way that seems attractive and is, at least I find, is worth an alternative explanation. It's just as valid as any other explanation. But
Yeah.
obviously that, those are more ideas that I'm throwing out there. I don't hold on to them. I think the idea that is the most fundamental and the most important, I believe, is the idea that Abraham made a covenant with a mortal, and that mortal was elevated to the rank of deity, became known as Baal Berith initially in Shechem, and through time, Baal was repudiated. Maybe there was too many Baals, and again, under the affliction of Egypt, the priesthood decided to solidify and come back to the original covenant, and decided to change the name, and that's where Yah came from, I believe.
Yeah. That's yeah. Yeah, I like the connection you make with Baal Berith, and the idea that could that have been the god or lord that Abraham made his covenant with, because Shechem was where it happened, and
Yeah.
yeah, as someone who has been moving away from traditional religion lately, I've been thinking that the Bible becomes a whole lot more interesting when you can dissect it from a non-committal perspective.
Right. Yeah. I agree. It's actually been very interesting to follow your tweets in your own kind of how your approach to different perspective has evolved just in the last year. I must say I enjoy your tweets because you come across as very genuine, honest, self-critical in some ways, and I admire that. So
yeah. As of where I'm now, I'd still consider myself a Christian, a Catholic Christian, but I'm not really. I don't think Christianity was inspired by God. I think I'm not
yeah.
I'm what Philip Goff would call a a religious fictionalist. I
Yeah.
like the I
The
like
ethic and
the
the moral.
rituals of
Yeah.
I like the rituals of Christianity. I like the the liturgies. I like the community building. I like. I think the big story of Christianity is one of it's a God who loves
It's creation.
so much he'd be willing to die for it. And I think that you can't get more altruistic than that. But I just don't believe it's
Mm.
it's inspired by God. I feel like there could there could be a God, but my commitment to platonic realism would put him under the laws of logic, so to speak, and
Yeah.
I don't think that's really compatible with Christianity.
And I'm very much aligned with that. I think of myself more of a if I had to put a banner somehow, be more of a pantheist or something like this. I mean,
Oh,
I do. I'm not. I don't like the etiquette of atheists because I do not reject the idea of something greater. I just came to the conclusion that that something greater is not the God that is described in the Bible.
yeah.
It is it there are I think there's glimpse of gods in the Bible. I think some of the authors, some of the scribes, some of the priests have obviously connected with that greater being in a way that us as human can,
Mm.
when we allow it. But to me, this work became important to me when I think I was contacted when I published my first book. I was contacted by a young Jehovah's Witness who sent me a note thanking me because he was raised in a Jehovah's Witness family, and at the age of 15 he decided to reject his faith and decided to move on with life. And he was about 20 when he wrote to me, so he was a young man. And he shared with me that he was finally able to sleep well because he was tormented ever since he'd left the faith. He was tormented by the idea that he might be punished, go to hell, because that's how he was brought up. If you don't believe, if you reject God, you're going to go to hell, you're going to burn for eternity. And even though from a rational perspective, he could reject it, emotionally, he was still caught with it. And when he read my work and he accepted the idea that this Lord that Abraham made a covenant with was immortal, for him, it was like it appeased him in a way that allowed him to carry on. So I thought that was one of the nicest testimony or thank you note that I received, because that's for me is the crux of the thing. It doesn't have anything to do with leaving faith or stop believing in something greater, as you say. From some of the teachings in the Bibles are wonderful and should apply to every human being, but others are just despicable and should be rejected or criticized at least.
Yeah, it's my personal belief that you can reject the dogma while still seeing value in the broad
Absolutely.
in the broader tradition. So I fast for Lent and I celebrate Christmas. Well, everyone does, but
Mhm.
yeah, and I go to church and I receive communion. I'll probably get my kids baptized. Yeah, and I read the Bible quite a bit, and I like the priests' homilies,
Yeah.
and and it's also interesting in some countries like for example Ireland, where my granddad is from. You um 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 Catholicism is so intertwined with the culture that
Yeah. Yeah.
it's almost more cultural than it
Yeah, I
is.
like your post. Yeah, you posted on that recently. Yeah.
You could also say
Yeah.
the say the same about the relationship that
Absolutely.
Jews have with their religion. A lot of them don't really believe it, but they still like following the mitzvah and the
Yeah.
and they
Yeah.
and they circumcise their children and they do bar mitzvah and all that.
Yeah. Well, that's it. When I felt in love with the Bible when I see it as a work of human minds
Yeah,
trying to comprehend the world. I find it so much more fascinating, so much more beautiful in its viability than its inherency,
yeah.
and its weaknesses. It makes it so much more human, so much more. Um,
It makes it a work of art.
yeah, exactly. Yes.
They didn't have because it shows you they were able to do all of this on their own
Yep.
without
And the
any
commitment, the
operation.
commitment over time is just fascinating.
Yeah,
And it, much of what we are today, we owe it to that work.
yeah,
And anybody, I mean, some people might argue that we would have been better off without the religion, and in some cases, yes, we might be, but if and should and would, it's very hard to say where we'd be. So we can only acknowledge what we've gone through and what it gave us.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
is there anything else you want to talk about?
Well, I'm just curious if you'd be interested. I mean, I'd be more than happy to get you a copy of my book. I it's not academic. It's somewhere between general public and academic. There are pieces in it that are more academic. There are pieces that are more, uh, for general public. But there's a lot more substance, references, and all that. And hey, at the end of the day, I'm looking for allies who are willing to engage. They don't need to buy into the stuff, just engage and question and ask question. And that's the only way we can get to the bottom of it, right? And so I'm
Yeah.
very grateful and thankful that you're reaching out and you're taking the time to do this.
Yeah, it's because I've had a lot of good good interactions with you, and
Mm-hmm.
I'd consider you you an online friend.
Mm, thank you. Yeah, likewise. Likewise. It's nice to have people like you out there.
There's other people I'd like to
Yeah, yeah, lots of nice people.
to have conversations with. I think I'd like to have maybe do an interview with David Falk, maybe
Mhm.
maybe maybe Ben from the Amateur Exegete
Mhm.
as well, and
Yeah, he's
who else?
also
Yeah,
very knowledgeable. Yeah, he's very knowledgeable in the New Testament, which is not an area that I'm knowledgeable at all. I mean, I'm familiar with the scriptures, but I haven't done any research whatsoever in that area. So
yeah. Oh, yeah. He has some good thing to say. He's actually the
yeah.
person who first brought you to my attention when I
Oh,
was
cool. Yeah.
posting something on when I was treating something on Abraham
Mhm.
in Genesis 14, and then he he brought you up. He said
Oh, great.
that you had that you had an interesting view.
Interesting take. Yeah.
Another
Certainly a
person,
different one.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Another person. Are you aware of of biblical historical context?
Yes.
Yeah, he's
Yes.
a good guy. Yeah,
Yeah. I haven't engaged with him. I've had, we exchange a few posts. He seemed to be a little more on the uh, traditional academic perspective. I haven't yet been able to open up a conversation.
yeah. So
But maybe one day,
yeah,
I mean, this is starts here.
yeah.
Great. Well,
So
listen, yeah, thanks a lot. It's
yeah.
it's it's
So
been fun.
one last thing.
Yeah.
Um, I was wondering what's the road forward from here with regards to your work.
Well, I mean, the next step is to finalize this comic, put it out, because the idea of the comic is to do exactly what we just did, which is to bring someone who's not aware of my work to look at the comic and say, huh, there's some interesting ideas in here. It doesn't just look rubbish. Maybe I'm not necessarily buying into it, but there's some ideas that I find interesting
Yeah,
and interesting enough to open up the conversation.
yeah,
That's the goal of the comic. It's only to bring more people to open up to a possible conversation. So my goal is to release it and finalize it and basically launch it, let's say on November 1st, which actually coincides with the Dia del Muertos in Mexico, which is the Day of the Dead. And I just think it's a great timing because if you've followed a little bit the celebration around the Day of the Dead here in Mexico is very unique in the way they celebrate their dead, and it's interesting because the spirit around how they celebrate their dead is very similar to what I believe the spirit around the Bronze Age celebration of the cult of the
yeah,
dead must have been like. And so
yeah,
it kind of brings you into this spirit, and it makes it understandable how they would have elevated their Lord into a higher being. And I mean, even the word pantheon, right? I mean, this is how they call cemetery here. Pantheon is, all the gods, right?
yeah,
so so it's interesting. So that's the next step. Actually, I wouldn't mind. I'll send you a link, but I haven't had any feedback or response. I'm not getting much, but I did a onomastic study on the names, on the theophoric names in the
Yes,
Old
I read
Testament.
it.
Oh, you read?
Yes,
Okay, oh,
but yeah,
interesting. Okay, so I thought it was interesting because it 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 kind of suggests that these texts may actually be older than we like to think they are, or at least been initially composed, or at least the myth or the stories behind them might actually be older than, what a lot of scholars may think.
yeah. I didn't realize until just now that the Day of the Dead was on All Saints Day, which makes sense, I guess.
Yes, yes. Yeah, yeah,
Because
exactly.
that's one of the Western Christian version of our that's the Western Christian version of ancestor veneration, I guess.
Absolutely. It all comes
So we
back to
don't,
it.
yeah, we don't really worship the undead,
No.
but we pray for them, which is which is good enough.
Yes.
We're
It's a good
concerned.
start.
We're concerned for their needs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, again, it's been fun. It's been a great discussion. Looking forward to having some more exchange with you. And again, I'll ping you after. But if you want to send me your contact, I'll send you a book, and then you can
Yeah.
take a look and let me know what you think.
I'm gonna stop the recording right now.
Okay.